to the debate.
Yeah, just to let you know that this session is being recorded as well. So we're hoping to post all this online. So if anyone misses the session today, they can go away and find this later. And that will be accompanied by a short report of an overview of all the sessions and the panels and the tracks today. We had a whole track of paper presentations yesterday on food waste. And we heard a lot from perhaps more kind of the consumer side there around some of the issues being raised. So it's great to talk about more the kind of business side at the moment. And this is really kind of poignant at the moment with the legislation kind of going through and being consulted on in the UK relating to mandatory food waste reporting.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm
Hi,
one of your panel chairs. Looking forward to a nice discussion.
So in terms of the format, it's a short bit of kind of context of what we're talking about today. And I'm going to give each panelist or speaker 5 minutes or up to 5 minutes just to introduce themselves. And then there's a series of questions that we can go through together. So yeah, but as I said, this is a kind of really timely topic at the moment, so it'd be great to get your take on this. Okay, I'll give it in 1 more minute. Okay, great. So we'll begin. So thank you everyone for coming to this panel debate, one of 3 at the Future of Food Symposium, and we're in the second afternoon of the event today. So we prepared Katrine prepared some slides around this topic, and it was really interesting that the DEFRA hosted a session a few months earlier telling everyone about kind of what's happening in this area, and there will be some kind of movement in policy. But I just want to reiterate here that this isn't just a kind of UK trend. There are other examples around the world where laws and legislations are being put in to kind of hold businesses to account or make them record what's being thrown away. I mean, I'm not going to go into the food waste issue here. I think we all know that food waste is a big problem, and the businesses play a really, really important role in tackling the problem. And you can't really kind of start tackling a problem unless you know how much waste is being thrown away in the first place. So we have examples here from Japan, where they have the food recycling law, South Korea as well, Waste Control Act in 2007, and the UK. So though this is proposed, it's not been implemented yet, but I think there's a lot of kind of excitement that something's happening in this space, and hopefully we can be put forward as a leader in pushing businesses to kind of report on what's being thrown away. But there are questions about whether this kind of goes far enough, and hopefully we can get into those today. So the UK overview, we know that this consultation is happening in 2021. Sorry, that's a question in the chat there. And then there's a kind of 3-month process, this consultation. Hopefully it will be then implemented in 2023, 2024. And this concerns larger, medium-sized businesses, wholesalers, etc., caterers. And it's all about what's being redistributed for human consumption, but also the more kind of material side of animal feed, what's being put in anaerobic digestion, etc. So it is kind of taking a whole across the material side of what's happening to food that these businesses are dealing with, and I'm sure the speakers can go into kind of further details with further examples. So in terms of how this is putting in, we've had some regulations already in 2016 around kind of reporting that relates to the environment. This will be an annual reporting process that relates to the financial year. Websites will be kind of put up to publish the data on, etc. Quality assurance checks, and some kind of enforcement and compliance. I think that perhaps that's a bit unclear at the moment about what happens if you don't report, etc. And how businesses will be kind of held account to some of these statistics that they're putting forward. But all in all, it's a kind of positive step forward. So in terms of our panel speakers today, we've got three great panel speakers. So firstly, Dr. Carrie Bradshaw from University of Leeds, Francesca Goodman-Smith, who's joining us from Australia, I believe. Is that right? So great, thank you for joining us from there. And also Martin Bowman, so Senior Policy and Campaigns Manager at Feedback, and a prominent kind of campaigner in this area. So I think I'll hand over now. Does anyone like to kind of put themselves forward to give us a short kind of brief introduction about you and your organisation? I'll stop sharing as well.
I mean, I'm first on the list only by alphabetical order, but I'm happy to go first, if only just by alphabetical order. Maybe Martin's ahead of me, but I'm happy to go first if that gets people off the hook.
Go for it, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So thank you for inviting me to be on this panel today. My name is Carrie. I'm a lecturer in law at the University of Leeds. My general research is at the intersection of environmental law, company law and regulation. And my initial interest in food waste was part of my broader work on corporations and in the environment. And that included a small case study on supermarkets and how they manage food and packaging waste. So I came into food waste through a slightly different angle. But for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been working exclusively on food waste as a distinct law and policy problem. My published research explores the limitations of applying sort of generalized legal principles of waste law to food waste specifically, including some of the challenges around the legal definition of waste and the limitations of the waste hierarchy. I've also worked on the shifting frames underpinning England's policy on food waste, which has had talks the talk of a slightly different approach to food waste, comparing the resources and waste strategy to previous policy iterations, but still I think has a promised sense of action, which actually obscures an ongoing reluctance on the part of the government in England to intervene on food waste where I think it's needed most. And my research has highlighted that, as well as sort of adding to a body of scholarship, as well as work, particularly by feedback in the grey literature, that highlights the limitations of the current sort of voluntary, outsourced and largely fragmented approach to food waste. And in turn, that research supports legislative interventions, possibly, I've suggested before in my published research, extended producer responsibility regimes, which I think we ought to be thinking about hand in hand with food waste reporting, as well as the need for better integrating food waste within food, climate and agricultural law. So that's sort of my work as an academic with the University of Leeds. Since 2018, I've also been a parliamentary academic fellow working with the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, helping to support scrutiny of government actions on food waste. And I'm hopefully, I hesitate to say this because every time I say I'm in the final stages of completing the work, something else happens and I don't finish it, but I am in the final stages of completing a post brief for the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, which will assess the evidence base for food waste of interventions across the supply chain and considers the implications of this for law and policy in England. I hope that was less than 5 minutes, but I'll be quiet now. Thank you very much for having me.
Who would like to go next, Martin, or?
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. I've got maybe overkill here, but I've got a mini presentation to go with my introduction, if that's okay. Cool, I'll try and share that now. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can see that.
Fantastic, great. Yeah, so hi, yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. Really looking forward to this conversation, and yeah, really important topic. So yeah, hi, I'm Martin. I'm a Senior Policy and Campaigns Manager at Feedback. We're an environmental NGO who started off purely focused on food waste, grew out of Tristram Stewart's book on the topic. And we have over a decade's worth of experience of sort of campaigning on this issue, producing sort of some of the reports that you can see on screen, but also lots of sort of campaign. But yeah, I'll get stuck into the issue. So, I mean, a little bit of background that I thought a bit of scene setting it might be helpful to do is that the food waste has positioned itself as the leader on food waste. But when you actually drill down into the detail of how much food has been reduced in businesses, it's remarkably unimpressive. So actually to date, we've reduced food waste in the retail, manufacturing and catering sectors from 3.11 to 2.88 million tonnes over 7 years. It's about 1% reduction per year. And I think it's not beyond the powers of imagination to imagine that could go faster. And on current track under voluntary commitments, we're only planning to reduce that down to 2.34 million tonnes, which is a bit faster, about 1.5% per year reduction. But the important thing to note here is this completely excludes primary production food waste, which goes completely unmeasured currently, but estimates currently show that it may be higher than all of the food wasted at retail, manufacturing and catering put together. So potentially over half of business food waste in the UK is just locked out currently of all voluntary commitments and measurement. On transparency too, I won't go into this too much now as I know we're coming onto this later, but just a bit of background feedback. I've been campaigning on food waste transparency for a very long time now. We had talks with Tesco in 2013 where we convinced them to become the first UK food business to publish their food waste data. But since then, really, despite a huge amount of campaigning from multiple organisations and celebrity chefs for transparency, we still, nearly a decade after the launch of the first voluntary agreement, still only have 60 companies reporting their food waste data voluntarily. And so what we've seen is a recognition of this in, for instance, this EFRA committee report, which said that voluntary commitments weren't delivering on transparency and we needed mandatory action. Even people like Tesco, in a pretty unprecedented intervention, have called for mandatory food waste reporting and say that we'll miss the SDG goals if this isn't implemented. RAP, who are usually pretty wedded to voluntary approaches, have even started coming out saying it's not a question of if, it's a question of when this happens. So a few feedback have begun to be campaigning for a few things for this mandatory food waste reporting to include. Top of our list is for it to include primary production. No country in the entire world to date has robust data on how much food is wasted on farms, so this would have global significance. If you look at this chart based on estimates of how much is wasted on farms, it's as you can see, it's a huge part of the picture and it shouldn't be overlooked. Currently, it's food wasted on farms left unharvested in the field is locked out of the food loss index, international reporting standard for food waste. Food loss is a problematic term in itself, as it implies this food is sort of lost down the back of the sofa accidentally, but actually, it's there's lots of intentional factors at play. A recent WWF report is well worth paying attention to in this respect. It sort of exploded the myth that food waste on farms is a developing country problem caused by poor infrastructure, and showed that actually food waste on farms was higher in industrialized countries, which kind of blows this myth open and shows how important this is. We also have a Champions 12.3 document that recommends that the halve per capita food waste in the SDG be interpreted from farm to fork, covering food loss too. So we should be including that in our target. One of the things we're currently doing is campaigning for the government to speed up action. So their current, I think you've just laid out roughly their kind of timescale for this. We think that's far too slow. And for instance, they also promised a consultation on mandatory food waste targets, which they're currently saying is probably not going to happen until 2026 or 7, which is an absurd delay, over 10 years after they originally promised this in the waste resources strategy. So our proposed timeline is for the reporting to the consultation to be delivered immediately on both targets and extended producer responsibility schemes. And then for businesses who already have their food waste data but are currently keeping it secret, to immediately report their food waste publicly in 2022, and then all other businesses to report by 2023. And we think that's achievable. We've been doing a few things like email actions from our supporters at DEFRA to try and make them finally deliver this consultation, which was already 2 years late and still shows no sign of being set in stone when it happened. We got some coverage in The Guardian over 9 months ago saying, why is it delayed? And it's still not being confirmed when it be. We raised an amendment with the Environment Bill calling for some urgent action on this too, to try and bring it forward. And basically, we're kind of currently coordinating responses to the consultation and trying to mobilise support for ambitious timescales and inclusion of farms. So we'd love for you to get in touch with us and get involved in those coordinated responses, which we're sort of coordinating across industry as well, so like farmers organisations and unions as well. So yeah, a whistle-stop tour. That's enough of me, and look forward to the discussion. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks Martin. And Francesca, do you want to give yours?
Yes, absolutely. I've got a couple of slides too that I will quickly share with you. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, we can see that.
Yeah, great. Okay, hello everyone. I'm Francesca Goodman-Smith. I am the Transform Program Leader at Fight Food Waste Cooperative Research Centre in Australia. So we are a 10-year federally funded organisation to deliver on Sustainable Development Goal 12.3 for Australia. So we here in Australia are slightly behind where you are in the UK in terms of activity towards food waste reduction. Our national food waste strategy was launched in 2017, and then the Fight Food Waste Cooperative Research Centre started in 2018. But we are coming in guns blazing and hoping to do some really exciting activity. So the Fight Food Waste Cooperative Research Centre is an R&D organisation. We partner industry and researchers to deliver high quality, evidence-based solutions towards reducing food waste. And we have 3 research programs. So one is the Reduce program, all around food waste prevention. One is the Transform program, which I lead, and that's around food that can't be prevented, how we add value and transform that into new usable products, preferably upcycled foods or at the top of the food waste hierarchy. And then we also have an Engage program all around outreach to industry and to consumers and to get consistent, clear, evidence-based messages out there and connect different industry groups and I guess public together and build momentum around the food waste issue. So the organisation has $120 million equivalent worth of funding over this 10-year period. So that's in kind and cash funding. So we can provide $1 for every industry dollar put in for research projects. So it's a really exciting opportunity to really build those partnerships between researchers and industry. We also have another entity called Stop Food Waste Australia, which was announced late last year. And this is our industry outreach arm of the organisation. And they are a public-private partnership tasked with delivering the voluntary agreement for food waste prevention in Australia. So this is called the Australian Food Pact, and it is due to launch in October this year. And there's 4 key areas of action around there. So it's really focused around building that coalition of the willing, that pre-competitive space for businesses to come together and tackle food waste issues. And very importantly, relating to the conversation today, is really building that measurement base and creating those frameworks for reporting food waste tonnages and then setting targets around reduction and really helping businesses through that process. So I really look forward to the conversations today. I was thinking when Carrie was speaking, my journey into food waste actually also began at a retail in a supermarket space. So for my master's research, I measured food waste in supermarkets in New Zealand, and then ended up working as a waste minimisation manager for one of the big supermarket chains in New Zealand. So really look forward to hearing your perspective today. And Martin, likewise, really excited to hear from you. When you mentioned the on-farm stuff, our target in Australia around halving food waste actually extends across the whole food supply chain. So we're committed to tackling the on-farm food waste as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have the Australian perspective in this discussion, especially.
Pleasure.
Great.
Sorry, I'm just trying to stop sharing my screen. Oh, there we go.
Great.
Cool.
Okay, so we have 25 minutes, half an hour now to make our way through the questions. And if any of the track chairs want to come in and direct the conversation, then feel free to do that. And if anyone watching wants to put any comments in the chat, we have time at the end, we can go and address those. So I'll just share my screen with the questions again. So perhaps we can start off by considering what's led us to this point where governments are suggesting mandatory food waste reporting for businesses, and what support is there for food waste reporting. Does anyone want to come in on that one to start us off?
I can kick us off unless anyone else wants to come in. I mean, I guess I touched on that a little bit. I mean, basically what's led us to this point is the more or less complete failure of voluntary measures to lead to food waste transparency. We've had sector-wide reporting on some sectors, although even at that level we've seen problems. So currently we don't have any really robust data on catering food waste either in the hospitality and food services sector. WRAP's recent estimates of that were based on guesses based on their previous data gathering. So manufacturing a bit better, as I say, for farms, nothing at all. So at the sector level, we've got huge problems, but at the individual business level, so that we can actually see what individual businesses are reporting. As I say, since Tesco reported in 2013, I think one thing that happened there is that Tesco, for all their other faults, reporting food waste was quite a good thing. But actually what happened somewhat inevitably with that is they got lots of headlines which all said Tesco wastes this much. And I think that spooked a lot of other businesses. And I think this is the problem with voluntary reporting, is that you have to a certain extent stick your head above the parapet and risk criticism. Whereas if you create this pre-competitive regulation, so everyone has to do it, you avoid that problem. And I think that's partly why, even following the food waste reduction roadmap that now sits alongside Courtauld, which did promise at its outset to have lots of businesses coming forward to publicly report their food waste, actually an embarrassing number of those people who signed up to that are still reporting their food waste data in secret to WRAP. As I say, only 60 people reporting, and almost all of those are Tesco suppliers. So Tesco have made a bit of progress, but almost everyone else is keeping silent, keeping their figures secret. So, I think this reflects along the fact that even WRAP, who have been wedded to the voluntary agreement, are now exasperated with this situation and just can't go on with this lack of data, I think points to the fact that we need to just skip the voluntary step and go straight to regulation in other countries who are looking to emulate the UK.
It's really interesting. I thought it was interesting how you highlighted the kind of negative aspects that Tesco have kind of come forward, but they kind of got some negative press from reporting their food waste. Carrie and Francesca, have you got a comment on how it got to this stage?
Yeah, I guess I'll just go first and just say very quickly that obviously a little bit of impetus comes from the EU Circular Economy package, which includes requirement for member states to measure food waste at all stages of the supply chain and to report on that. And even though the UK has left the EU, we were supposed to within the transition period, implement the circular economy package. We still really haven't done that. So there was a legal driver at the supranational level that can be, you can trace some of the impetus for that in the promise to consult that the government made in 2018 in the resources and waste strategy. And I guess, I don't know, Martin might know this better because I know feedback talk to supermarkets a lot more than I do, but I wonder whether Tesco hoped that everyone would follow suit and that they would sort of themselves raise the kind of the de facto norm, but actually we're just seeing a continuation of the kind of race to the regulatory bottom and a further indication of some of the limitations of relying on voluntary approaches.
Great. And Francesca, so what's the Australian take on this? Are businesses coming out and reporting their food waste, or is this kind of voluntary or mandatory? How does it work?
Yeah, look, we're at early stages here. We're just about to launch our voluntary approach this year, and I think we look to the court-hold agreement in the UK as a model for what we're looking to implement here, but hopefully take some of the lessons to be able to encourage that transparency right at the offset. So I think, it's a different situation here in Australia because we began this journey a little bit later. So looking at the UK, it makes so much sense to be heading in the direction that you are because you've gone through the voluntary, you've taken those learnings. But I think, across the globe, we can see it's being more and more recognized that food waste is a problem. More and more businesses are, putting waste reduction targets in their corporate social responsibility strategies, and publishing that data really holds them accountable to that. So I think, you can't deny that. And data from studies, a colleague of mine, actually, Diane McGrath, she recently published her thesis on looking at hospitality food waste, and it clearly showed that if you're measuring food waste, you're much more likely to see reduction in that amount of food waste. So I think the facts and figures are there for sure. So it's about kind of the timing of things as well. I think here in Australia we need to build the resources, and we need to take businesses on that journey, and we need to show them this is how you create a food waste inventory, and you measure it and you report it. So I think we're starting at the right spot, but the UK is in a different place. Great.
Yeah. I mean, I wondered if there's a kind of lesson to be learned from the UK, that, especially Martin's points, that the voluntary kind of route hasn't worked here. I mean, obviously there's a different context in Australia. But yeah, so that's obviously something to think about. I mean, we should move to the next question about costs and benefits, and we've discussed some of these already. But I wondered, is it always a kind of negative reaction to this? Is it always the case that a business comes out and says, actually, we waste this much food? How do we address that in such a way that they're willing to come out and say this? And is there a way of doing this so it hasn't got to a point where it's mandatory and they have to report? Was it just failure?
I'll have a little go at this one. So one of the interesting things is, the way you present information and how you present it. And I guess, in Italy, their approach was to publish food donation figures and sort of reinforce and support the good behavior. And I'd be interested to see what the other panelists think of that approach. It's quite, it's obviously not the full picture, but it's a way of giving businesses credit for taking that step.
Yeah, if I could jump in as well. I mean, I think the big thing here is that Tesco have come out in support of regulation, and it's pretty unusual for a company like Tesco to make a public policy intervention like this. So I think this really shows the extent of the frustration by people like Tesco, who have voluntarily reported, at seeing that this isn't being replicated by anyone else. And I think it's worth going into a bit of detail about what's happened over the last decade. There's been a remarkable amount of pressure on this in the public eye. We've had Hugh Fearnley-Whittenstall did a primetime TV show on this with a huge petition. calling pretty much solely for businesses to publish their data. That got huge uptake. We had a change.org petition I was involved with that got over 250,000 signatures. It's one of change.org's biggest petitions, calling on supermarkets to publish the food waste in their supply chain. We had Tier Fund ran a campaign about this. We had the Evening Standard newspaper ran a league table of different supermarkets reporting their food waste data, and managed just about to get Sainsbury's to publish their in-store food waste data, but nothing else. So despite this is, had a huge, unprecedented amount of public pressure, and despite all of that, the businesses have still not reported. And I think that you see that now, that businesses are beginning to see that it's so obvious they have failed to do this, that I think actually a lot of businesses we've talked to are recognising that we do need regulation now. And we've talked with even farming groups who are quite supportive of this now. So there is quite wide support within the industry for this, I think, because that none of them want to stick their head above the parapet and report and risk backlash. They prefer for it to be done. So yeah, I think absolutely there is a risk that the RAP Courtauld model is currently being exported around the world. And we need to learn not just from the successes of that, but from the failures of it. And I think one of the lessons is to skip straight to regulation on this matter.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think there is a consensus now. It's been hard fought for, and Tesco intervening has helped. But I think there is a consensus that mandatory reporting is necessary, but it won't be sufficient. I think this is if I had to say one thing about mandatory reporting, it would be necessary but not sufficient. And I think we need to dispense with a little bit of what lawyers like to, they like to get their Latin out and call it a non sequitur, but a non sequitur is a conclusion or a statement that doesn't logically follow from the previous argument or statement. And the non sequitur in this area is this idea of what gets measured, gets managed. They don't necessarily follow. You absolutely can't manage or prevent what you don't measure. That's obvious, but the incentives have to be there in order to reduce that food waste once you know how much you're creating. Now, often within a single entity, there's a clear business case for reducing the food that you waste. Wasting food is an economic cost. The really wicked problem in the food waste supply chains is the waste that's driven by one entity beyond their own organizational realm. So this really is the actors that are often focused on here are retailers, and all the incentives that are in place for retailers to push waste and the cost of waste elsewhere on the supply chain. And that's where the incentives, the business case, the financial carrot, if you like, just is weaker. We have the government in the waste prevention programme had talked about the robust business case for food waste prevention. Champions 12.3 have looked at that as well, but they're all really within single entity organisations, and the sort of incentives for retailers to drive food waste in the supply chains, I think, is much more questionable. So there are limits to this voluntary approach. And when you look at the wording in the waste prevention programme, reporting is bundled together with a business case voluntary approach to food waste. And I think my concern is that, and this is the kind of the second point that I would want to make, is that reporting is another sort of piecemeal foray into an already quite crowded and fragmented governance space. We've got so much going on in food waste in the UK. We've got Courtauld in the roadmap. We've got Love Food, Hate Waste. We've got the grocery code adjudicator who has a little bit of a remit around food waste. We've got new unfair trading practices, practice powers under the Agriculture Act. There's a possibility of extended producer responsibility in the future. It's all looking increasingly unwieldy. And actually, I think a more sensible approach would be to take a step back, look for integrated, joined up, holistic approaches, and see mandatory reporting as one piece of a very, very complex puzzle. And I think I'm nervous that the reason why there's so much support for reporting is it's another way to kick mandatory legislation and meaningful intervention another 10 years down the line.
Amen. If I'm sorry, I don't want to. Is it okay to add a quick follow on to that? This is Carrie's. I completely agree with that, and we know that to be the case. Basically, from the government's timeline, we see that they pledged a review of mandatory food waste reduction targets and extended producer responsibility, which I absolutely agree are essential as well. And transparency alone, we know from all sorts of other environmental things that just putting the data out there doesn't work. You need to also put targets in place and regulation. Yeah, they promised that in 2018 Wastes and Resources Strategy. It's now looking like, because they're saying, oh, we're going to wait for ages to deliver mandatory reporting, and then we're going to wait a few years to see how that goes, and then consider mandatory target. We're not going to get a review on that timeline of mandatory targets and extended producer responsibility until about 3 years before the Sustainable Development Goal target, which leaves no time at all. It's just can kicking down the road. And so really, yeah, absolutely. I think we need a consultation on all of those things now together for immediate, because we know that businesses we have 10 years of experience to show that businesses are reducing food waste at a rate of 1% a year. And I think it's highly doubtful that the mandatory reporting on its own will change that significantly.
And I'll add one thing, and then I'll obviously allow others to ask questions. But even if you were being, even if I take off my cynical hat, it could just prevent problems later down the line if we looked at things like extended producer responsibility and targets now. Even if there isn't a promise to implement or respond to those, get the evidence-based emergency, start pilot projects, galvanize academics and other research institutes to start thinking about extended producer responsibility regimes now alongside the reporting, because there could be things that we could do around the reporting regime and the detail of the reporting regime that could support further initiatives later. So I think this sort of piecemeal approach is really counterproductive, and it also creates problems with ownership. It's difficult to see in government who has ownership over these issues. We've got, DEFRA and BEAS. We've got multiple regulators. RAP's sort of a regulator, but it's outsourced. You've got the Grocery Code adjudicator. You've got the Environment Agency. Maybe the Rural Payments Agency, whoever's going to be dealing with the unfair trading practices. It's really complicated, and this is an opportunity. And the Resources and Waste Strategy was an opportunity to take a step back, adopt what the government called a new approach to food waste. And actually, what I think is we're on the train towards is more of the same, more sort of knee-jerk, fragmented, piecemeal interventions without looking at the whole picture.
So I'll allow Francesca to come back in. It'd be great to get her view on this. But I just wondered that you've said that Australia perhaps a bit behind where the UK are. But in terms of moving forward, is the kind of rate of change and the rate of kind of hope of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, is that quicker than what's happening at the UK at the moment? And is it a piecemeal strategy or something more kind of holistic?
Yeah, so it is all coming together quite holistically. We actually just published a new rerun of our National Food Waste Baseline, and we did a feasibility study looking at the different hotspots around food waste prevention activities, and which are going to be the most successful measures to reduce food waste. And as part of that, there was modelling done around, are we going to reach the Sustainable Development Goal by 2030? And the modelling shows yes, we will by 2029. So it's tight, but I think we will get there, and it is quite a coordinated approach. Yeah, I would say, there's totally get those comments around, why not just skip straight to the mandatory, but all of these regulations take a lot of time. So I think a voluntary approach in the meantime is probably a useful way. It's, don't wait for the regulation, get started. And also, as Carrie said, I couldn't agree more. It's one part of the whole suite of things that need to be in place to actually achieve meaningful change. And I would say at the end of the day, you have to think about what is the goal, and is mandatory reporting going to encourage businesses to work towards the goal, or is it just going to be another compliance burden? So yeah, that's what I would say. I think it's about creating the frameworks for measuring and reporting in the right way, so there's consistency. I think we're really getting there around consistency, but there is still a way to go. Also creating that, space where businesses can be vulnerable and say, what, we don't know where to start and we don't know how to tackle this issue, and to give support and guidance and really, look at the value chain, encourage businesses to talk to their suppliers and talk to other people in the system to get those systemic issues overcome and given airtime and put on the table. So yeah, it is a very complex issue, and it's been named a wicked problem for a reason.
We've got around 5. Go on.
I just wanted to come into what Francesca said about the goal. That's really important. There's actually quite a lot of research, legal research, that suggests that these kind of processes for their own sake do tend to lead to that compliance tick box approach. But if you build it within a system that has a target, and that doesn't have, in the absence of a national target, that could be a company self-set target that they aim to reduce their waste themselves, and then you build in a management system or a roadmap, if you want to use Courtaulds language. You build in a management system that helps an organization report on, measure its food waste, build in a policy and a plan to reduce that, have a framework where that management systems audited and verified, review that every 2 or 3 years, so you could build the reporting into a much broader kind of food waste management or prevention plan. And in the UK, we used to have something similar for construction waste. Before the coalition government came in the UK, we had something called the site waste management plans, which were a mandatory obligation on construction companies to plan how they were going to deal with the waste they generated on site. That would be a really sensible process to attach to a reporting obligation and make the goal not, as Francesca said, just another compliance requirement, but actually towards what we're trying to achieve, which is a reduction in food waste.
Do you have any examples of like best practice, Martin? I'm thinking that we've got around 5 minutes left, and I think we've mainly answered the second question there, but perhaps we could turn to maybe lessons learned and good practice going forward.
Yeah. Sorry, do you mean best practice from a business perspective, or from a policy, like for governments?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge to see what kind of governments can do, given the kind of current political climate.
Yeah, of course. I think one thing to maybe say is that I think a joined up series of policies, like Carrie mentioned, for governments to implement is so important. We've seen, I think, just to come back to the point about, it takes time for legislation to come in. I think one of the key barriers as a group who've been campaigning for regulation consistently, is voluntary agreements often are the excuse for not implementing regulation. They are slowing the implementation of that down. They're the kind of front. And I've seen that at the Food Loss and Waste platform in the EU, the UN Food Systems Summit that's coming up. We're proposing regulation, and it's banished to an annex as some optional, weird, potential extra. And all of the core things that are researched and promoted are around voluntary commitments, voluntary redistribution of food waste to charities, enterprises, and and regulation is often considered outside the pale. I think what's really exciting opportunity coming back to the EU is that although there were proposals for mandatory food waste targets for member states as part of the Waste Framework Directive that then got diluted and fought back against by the Council and Commission, the Parliament had originally put that in. What did survive that process was a review that's coming up in 2023 of mandatory food waste target for member states. So that's a really exciting opportunity to potentially set legally binding food waste reduction targets across the EU. And I think we should start mobilising for that now. And if possible, try and get a few individual countries to start putting in place that regulation now. As part of the excuse for excluding that from consideration is that there's no concrete examples of any of this happening. And that's why this mandatory food waste reporting is so exciting, because it will be an actual concrete piece of legislation we can point to and show how much better, well, hopefully it works than legislation. Hopefully that answered you in a roundabout way. Oh, sorry, and one last thing actually, is it is absolutely insane that unharvested food waste is excluded from the food loss index currently. It's a gaping hole, and that just needs to be amended. We need to start raising pressure for that to be included. The reason it's been excluded is because of this assumption that unharvested food waste is a poor country problem. Those countries might not have the resources to do that measurement. But now it's become clear that the food waste on farms is even higher in rich countries. That excuse completely evaporates, and we need to start making those countries report that data, because it could be one of the biggest sources of food waste in the whole supply chain. It's completely invisible at the moment.
So sadly, we need to draw to a close now, because we're in 15 minutes, we'd move on to the next part of the symposium, but I wondered if Francesca and Carrie had any kind of final points you wanted to raise.
Sorry, we're both waiting for each other to go. I would just say I think it's important as well that and Carrie will probably have far more insights on this, that the legislation is considered as a package of policy levers, and you don't want to create adverse or perverse incentives in other parts of the supply chain. You don't suddenly want to see food rescue organizations being used as landfills instead of actually giving good quality food to people. So I would say that the suite of policy levers need to be considered as a package.
Yeah, I entirely agree. And we've already learned the hard way about perverse incentives in the UK with anaerobic digestion and food waste. And I guess the only thing I would add, and I promise I will be very quick, is we don't always need to reinvent the wheel. I think it's important to use existing legal mechanisms that we already have in place. So we have this thing called the waste hierarchy. It is a legal obligation. It could be enforced, and food waste reporting could be embedded and supported within, for example, the waste duty of care. So a similar point to Francesca about integrated, joined up approaches, using what we already have and looking at the legal and the policy system as a whole.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I know Shantanu has a question. I'm just aware that at 2 o'clock, the next part of the symposium starts in the other Zoom link. I'll have to be there to start. But if the speakers are happy to have another question, then Shantanu, you can fire away.
Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, a great discussion. And I would just more of a thought that relate to some of the questions that came up is, what is the incentive a business has, in reporting food waste? And also what Francesca said, that if you report food waste, it can maybe help them reduce their food waste. And I'm wondering, because right now when we talk about reporting food waste, we're probably talking about reporting how many kilos that you wasted. And yet now I'm talking with some companies who are developing some, let's say, AI solutions that can give you a more granular picture of what you're wasting. And that can, for example, help catering companies actually have an incentive to report that, because if they have a more granular picture of, I don't know, what ingredient they are wasting, or if there's something in the menu that they're making a lot that doesn't get sold, then that might also give them an incentive to implement these, food waste initiatives, and therefore then report that, I guess. So I guess in some sense, if we can, that is a thought I had, in terms of, if we have these more AI solutions, if they get a more granular picture, can they get a more clear value add reporting? Can that help them reduce their costs? Perhaps that could kickstart the process, or accelerate the whole thing.
Thanks for that point, Shantanu. So I think I'm going to have to go in a minute, but I just want to say thank you to the speakers. It's been really, really insightful, and I feel like this is really evolving at the moment, this topic. It's really timely, and it's great to have the perspective of what's happening in Australia as well. I think we really benefited from that. So as I said, we've recorded this, so I'm sure we'll post it and make it available to other people. And we have got the opportunity to produce like a podcast. So if anyone's interested in kind of continuing the conversation, that's something we could look into as this develops over the kind of next few weeks and months, etc. And thank you to the track chairs as well. Thank you for putting together the presentation and for your comments as well. And I'm sure if anyone else has any questions, they can get in contact with you. Thank you so much. I feel like this is something that could